Maulana Zadna. It is my privilege to host you all again for the second plenary session of the two-day international conference on translating cultures, exploring the intersections of language and literature, organized by the National Translation Mission, Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, in collaboration with the Department of English, Maulana Azad National Urdu University, Hyderabad. I extend my warm welcome to each one of you. It is my honor to present to you our chair for the session, Professor T. Vijay Kumar. I request you, sir, please come up on the stage. Professor Vijay Kumar currently teaches at BITS, Plenary, Hyderabad. Formerly, he was professor and head of the Department of English, Osmania University, Hyderabad. He has presented papers at several international conferences in University, Australian National University, University of Malta, University of British Columbia, and University of Cyprus. His publications include Critical Studies, Indian Languages in the Diaspora, English and Other International Languages, and translations from Telugu. He is also a TEDx speaker and a founder editor of Muse India, the literary journal. I welcome you, sir. I now invite the first distinguished speaker of our plenary session, Professor Anisur Rahman, to please come on the stage. Professor Anisur Rahman is a literary critic, translator, and bilingual poet in English and Urdu. Formerly a professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and senior advisor at Rekta Foundation. He has to his credit 5 critical books, 5 edited, co-edited volumes, 3 collections of Urdu poetry in English translation, and 1 collection of his English poetry, apart from over 90 essays and reviews in books and journals. His latest twin volumes, Hazaron Khwahish-e-Aisi, The Wonderful World of Urdu Ghazals, and Hazar Rang Shairi, The Wonderful World of the Urdu Nazm, showcase the best of Urdu poetry in English translation from the beginnings in the 16th century to now. Professor Rahman has been an academic administrator at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and worked as the head of the Department English, Dean Students Welfare, Registrar, and the Director of Residential Coaching Academy. He was a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada, and a visiting scholar at Purdue University. I welcome you, sir. I now invite the second distinguished speaker of this plenary session on the stage, Professor Akshaya Kumar. Professor Akshaya Kumar is the head of the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Punjab University, Hyderabad. Professor Kumar has a Chandigarh, sorry, my mistake. Chandigarh. Professor Kumar has a teaching experience of over 33 years. He has produced outstanding works in the field of translation. A book of literary criticism authored by Professor Kumar has been acknowledged by World Literature Today, the second oldest literary journal in the world, published by the University of Oklahoma, United States, as one of the essential books on modern Indian writing since independence. World Literature Today has chosen Professor Kumar's Poetry, Politics and Culture, Essays on Indian Texts and Context as one among the 60 books of modern Indian writings which have served as important literary markers in the post-independence India. I welcome you, sir. I now request our distinguished chair to initiate the plenary sessions.
Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you for asking me to chair this session. I'm delighted to be among friends once again, Professor Anisur Rahman and Akshay Kumar. I've known them for quite some time, although they may not remember. And let me begin with a disclaimer. The bio note that the research scholar read was not sent by me. So don't blame me for the long introduction. That was not sent by me. It was the much shorter one I sent last night. Probably they didn't get it. So thank you very much. MANUU is not new to me. We held one edition of the Hyderabad Literary Festival here on this campus. Then we had a collaborative conference on translating cultures a few years ago. So it's wonderful to be back in MANUU. And since we are already behind schedule, I will reserve whatever little I have to say about the topic for later. So first, I would now request Professor Anisur Rahman to give his talk as the first speaker of the plenary session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Professor Vijay Kumar, and the most respected audience and members of this audience. Some of them are my colleagues and friends. Begin with thanks to Professor Imtiaz Hasnan, my old friend, and to Shagufta Shaheen, who talked to me about a month ago, and I readily agreed for the reasons are very obvious. So I need not impress upon the reasons why I agreed upon, because of the proximity that I have had with the university as also in the area that I have worked. Friends, I have 2 books, 2 volumes in my hand. Don't be scared. I'm not going to read all these 1,000+ pages to you. Just a few references that I'll make. So be at ease and be comfortable, as I would like to be comfortable myself. The title, you are already aware of this title, but I would like to draw your attention to this title once again. It says, when Urdu speaks with English, and says discoursing, translation as dialogue. And I make very brief points here. One, because the time is short, and the other because I would like interactions rather than make my own one-way communication to you. So my first point is that a look at the very title I would request you to have, and to look at the difference between speaking to and speaking with. To speak to someone is mostly one-way communication. It is assertive. You are speaking to someone, you are assertive, and you are not communicative the other way as well. It's very commanding, so to say, if you speak to someone. But when you speak with someone, there is a larger area of communication that develops automatically. So to speak with someone is a two-way mode of communication. It makes way for communication, and it implies developing a dialogue, a conversation, and a discussion. I consider translation to be an act of speaking with a language, and that is why I discard speaking to a language rather than choose speaking with a language. So when Urdu speaks with a language called English, my reference here is English, what does happen? And what does it happen, and how did it happen to me? How did I develop this kind of a conversation myself and with the poets that I was translating? Basically, I have been translating poetry all through my career and never any prose. So having said that, or underlined the difference between speaking to and speaking with, which is very vital for me to begin my point and to make my presentation, let me say that when two speakers speak the same language and they share their thoughts with each other, their words develop a dialogue through their speakers, which is very obvious. Now, interestingly enough, in this dialogue between two persons speaking the same language, you see that words from other languages also creep in. It happens in our day-to-day conversation. You will speak in Urdu, and sometimes you will see suddenly that the same sentence you repeat in the English language. So the two languages shake hand and the two languages go together. This also happens in the act of translation. This is one of the propositions I have before you. This is possibly the first sign of finding equivalence, and in translation, you find equivalence, to put it in a very simple term, though it can technically be developed in a larger thesis. But translation is an act of finding equivalence, trying to see how it echoes and how it translates through the idiom and through the culture and the literary baggage that the word carries with itself. So that is how it works, and this is the preliminary theoretical formulations that I'm beginning with, so that I can take you to some of the points that I need to make. Friends, having said that, these preliminary points that I have made, having said that, I have some questions to put and some tentative answers to offer in order to lay my ground. A, is a language necessarily independent. I'm a little hesitant in making this proposition in the presence of linguists here, 3 linguists that I know of who are here. Professor Narang is a linguist, Professor Imtiaz Hasnain is a linguist, and Professor Sayal is a linguist. So with some amount of diffidence, but yet with some amount of confidence, as a translator, I do make a proposition that is language necessarily independent and complete unto itself? My answer is no, it's not. B, is language a creative ensemble of figures of a speech, particularly in poetry? I repeat, B, is language a creative ensemble of figures of a speech, particularly in poetry? My answer is yes, it is. C, does that ensemble create a condition of music that we read in the lines of shorter and longer lengths and recognize as poetry? My answer is yes. D, when 2 languages speak with each other, and I'm referring to Urdu and English here, I translated from Urdu to English and I'm speaking to that. So when 2 languages speak with each other, do they enrich themselves? My answer is yes, they do. And E, who takes part in this dialogue? And this is a very important proposition point that I have discussed in a larger framework in my essay, which is included in my book called In Translation, Positions and Paradigms. This is published by Orient Black Swan, so to say, in 2019. And there is an essay which I have written, and it is called Translation as Collaboration. So I try to develop that idea there. So I say, who takes part in this dialogue that I call translation? Translation I call as a dialogue. The poet and the reader, number 1, the poet and the translator, number 2, or both. So there are 3 propositions. My answer is that the trio of the poet, the reader, and the translator. The poet, the reader, and the translator, this makes a trio. They take part in this tripartite dialogue at different stages of the evolution of the text and the translation of the text. This has been developed as a larger thesis in the book, in the essay that I have just referred to, Translation as Collaboration, in that book of mine called Translation, Positions and Paradigms, Orient Black Swan, 2019. And finally, that is F, and finally, is this trio of poet, translator, and reader inseparable? My answer is yes. So this brings me to posit that both writing and translating are dialogic acts. Primarily, they are dialogic acts. You develop a dialogue. In the case of original writing, the author develops a dialogue with himself first, then his own literary tradition, then his linguistic heritage to write his own text. Suppose if you're writing in Urdu, you develop a dialogue with yourself first, with the literary tradition to which you are drawing upon, and to the linguistic heritage that you are referring to. In this case, in the case of translation, that was the first proposition when you are writing in your own language. But when you come to translating, the translator develops a dialogue with the chosen text, And that language, that text, that language, that form, that literary device used there, and the broad literary culture that particular source text develops for you. These are, I'm just talking very, very briefly so that we have some time to interact together at the later part of this session. In writing his translation, that is the translator, me and you who translate, the translator thus emerges as the second author of the first text, which is the primary text, that is the source text, that imparts it an afterlife as well. So when you translate, you give an afterlife to the text also, and it crosses the boundaries of both time as also of space, which is very important for us to understand, to underline also at the same time the significance of this whole activity we have been engaged with in our country for the past 40, 50 years, more importantly and especially. This dialogue between the chosen text for translation and its author results in the reconfiguration of language, results in the language reconfigures. You will see, I will read some examples, and you can very easily see how my language helps to reconfigure, or how do I try to reconfigure that language in the English of mine, which I learned as the second learner, not as the first learner. The idea and the larger image of the text selected for translation. I repeat, the dialogue between the chosen text for translation and its author results in the reconfiguration of language. The idea and the larger image of the text selected for translation. Friends, I'm just making hints so that you can guess what I'm trying to say. There's no time to develop the thesis because I'm just going to give you the very basics of it, the moot points, that is to say. The translator thus problematizes his text and interrogates it to impart a new identity. Every text, every author calls for a reader. If I were to put it in a verse, in a share, I could say, Baya Warid Garijan Bhavat Zabatane. Garibe Sheher Sukhan Hai Guftani Darat. Is there anyone who knows this language? Come forward. Baya Warid Garijan Bhavat Zabatane. Is there anyone who knows this language? Come forward. Join my. Ji? Garijan Bhavat Zamadane, Garibe Shehrul Sukhan Hai. The writer, the translator does want to say something to you. This is not me, but me as the individual, but me as a translator, me as an author. He asks you to come and join hands to learn the language together. My thesis is this, that in translation, you learn your language as you learn others' language. So it is a double process of learning language and exchanging this art of language with each other, the writer and the translator. Now, having said this, these are some of the basic theoretical propositions that I wanted to present before you. I will just give you some examples of my own experiments and these two books that I have in hand to show you some of the examples from there. These are two books which are known as Hazaro Khwahishein Si, The Wonderful World of Urdu Ghazals. Now, this is the book which most of you have read or seen. This is an anthology of ghazals in Urdu from the 16th century onwards to now. 500 years of Urdu poetry, Urdu ghazal poetry in English translation. 60 poets are chosen there. This is 2019 end publication. It was brought forth in 2020. This is the latest one called Hazaron Shari, The Wonderful World of the Urdu Nazm. This again has the same scope starting from the 16th century and comes down to the present times. That is selecting 65 poets. And for each poet, I have two compositions that I have chosen and translated with an introduction. I understand that the job of a translator is not just to translate. You have to supplement your translations. Therefore, there is a long intro in the book. There is an intro to the age. There is an intro to the author, to the poet, so that you can contextualize, so that you know who you are addressing. Your reader is in a position to connect and then be able to appreciate your translation. Without these supplementing, translations cannot be complete, and that is why this book takes that kind of a shape. I try to develop a dialogue with the poets that I have chosen and their language and their texts and their devices. I will just show to you some of the examples that I have with me. In this process, as I said, I learned my own Urdu, which was my mother tongue and which is my mother tongue. And I also learned English, which is not my mother tongue, but by training, I learned this. I try to balance one language against the other without letting anyone overweigh and turn the machine of language upside down. This was a very precarious, very delicate exercise of handling language as if it was a weighing machine. So on the one hand, you have the target language, on the other hand, you have the source language and how they are interplaying. And the balance must be perfect. No one can claim that the balance can be perfect, but one has to try and to see if the balancing act, that is why translation I consider is a precarious act of balancing of the languages, two languages that you have chosen. Now with the language comes so many things together, the metaphor, the myth, I'm leaving out the simile and the other devices that one uses. So I also learned in this process my ways of negotiation with the literary tropes and the traditions, to name just some of the two of the most important ones. My training as a student and as a teacher of English poetry, I taught poetry most of my life, and I also translated poetry most of my career. I didn't teach fiction or criticism, very little. So they provided me the vital feedback for me to develop as a translator of whatever worth I was or I was not. So my own training in my language and the target language, that was my own teaching profession language. So that was my advantage. My study of the English and the American and the post-colonial, that helped me a lot in trying to develop, understand how my language could develop in this text, which I'm trying to proceed with. So let me give you one example of only one poet, relevant in the sense that you are here in Hyderabad, and I'm referring to a poet, Sultan Quli Qutub Shah. It makes sense, I understand, so that you can appreciate. Now I'm going back in time and selecting a poet from the late 16th century with the reason that we are talking here in Hyderabad, and here it is that this poet was the first known poet of 50,000 shares or couplets to his credit, and that is how he is known as the first Sahib-e-Diwan Shair of Urdu. Now, Quli Qutub Shah, was born in 1565. Dates are, debatable, and died in 1611. That is again debatable. That is the beginning, the first decade of the 17th century. Imagine 500 years. Fifth ruler of the Qutub Shahi dynasty of Golconda. Have the historical background in mind. And the founder of the city of Hyderabad. And also the founder of many of the genres and the linguistic habits and the practices that he developed for us, and thus became such an important major canonical figure. He knew Persian, Quli Qutub Shah knew Telugu, he knew Deccani, which was at then a point of time a variant of Urdu, and left behind, as I said, 50,000 ashar for us to develop upon and to read and to go forward with. He left a kulliyat, so to say. Only one copy, this is very interesting fact which I discovered while doing this book, only one copy of his complete works, compiled by his nephew, is available now at Salar Jung Museum. Only one copy of that. In Hyderabad, is it over? 5 minutes, I am told. Okay. Muhyiddin Qadri Zor compiled it and published in 1941. And this edition became the source of several such editions. So, cutting short, let me read some of the examples so that you can see how I was trying to balance the language. I promise you I will not exceed, just let me know when. बहुत फेमस गजल है कुतुब शाह की, पियाबाज प्याला पिया जाए ना, पियाबाज यक्तिल जिया जाए ना. सुनिए, मुशायरा नहीं है, गौर से सुनिएगा. Listen to this as how I have translated this. इसमें काफिया है, इसमें रदीफ है गजल में. उर्दू के शेर में और अंग्रेजी में भी एक काफिया है और एक रदीफ है. सो पियाबाज प्याला पिया जाए ना, आप देखिए कैसे रुकते हैं. पियाबाज यक्तिल जिया जाए ना, I can't ever drink my drink without my love. I can't ever breathe, I sing without my love. Look at the bricks. Then the second share is, कही थे पिया बिन सुबूरी करूं, कहिया जाए अम्मा किया जाए ना. I should be patient, you say, without my love. How unfair. I can't even blink without my love. The third share is, नहीं इश्क जिस्मों बड़ा कूड़ है, बदे उससे मिल भी सिया जाए ना. A boor indeed is one who cannot be in love. I am no boor. I am on the brink without my love. Qutub Shah न दे मुझ दीवाने को पंद, दीवाने को कुछ पंद दिया जाए ना. No counsels, Qutub Shah, none to this crazy one. I am the one. I can't even think without my love. 4 couplets, 4 shares. अच्छा, एक बात याद रखिए, कपलेट शेर नहीं होता. शेर अलग चीज़ है, कपलेट अलग है. ये गलतफहमी है कि कपलेट आप शेर को कहते हैं, बट उसके लिए तो बड़ा लंबा डिस्कशन है. So what I am trying to say, एक काफिया रदीफ मैंने मेंटेन करने की कोशिश की. Same form I try to imitate. I would use the word imitate. Same design of the couplets that you have or the share that you have, 2 lines going. Same breaks and the breadth that goes with that. So that is just one thing. Another thing that again from Quli Qutub Shah I will read out so that you know, and that is where I will finish because वो तो गजल थी. एक नज़्म है Quli Qutub Shah की, वो सुनिए आप और देखिए. This is called a hymn to God. I'm not reading the original Quli Qutub Shah because that will take time and I will exceed my. But I just want to listen to this as a poem, whether it works. 16th century language, how he was mixing up, and how I have tried to turn that into the contemporary language. वो एक हमद है, हमद वो नज़्म होती है जिससे कोई किताब शुरू होती है. It is in the praise of God. And his D-1 begins with that. So I have called this a hymn to God, and the poem is like this. The moon and the sun bear your glow. Your glow turns the dark night into day. None can ever be as you are, all life and soul to this man of clay. Only your name brings me comfort. In comfort, I offer my life to you. I repeat your name. You are my rosary. The world prays to you as I do. They remember you. They are all yours. Your love is greater than the world's love. You bestow what the world desires. The sky sends its rays from above. The last but one paragraph. I look up to you. I know you are kind. A kind God of heavens who sends his grace. You have what I need, provide all I want, and all you offer, I always embrace. And the last stanza is, the Deccan showers all its love on Qutb. Qutb adores his head with the Prophet's feet. He only prays to you, who else, as long as the soul and the body live. So the kind of a rhythm that was there. My whole idea of translating poetry is that in Urdu especially, you translate rhythm apart from the thought process that goes on. But rhythm is very important. So for me, the kind of rhythm that the Urdu original poem was, Qutb Shah's Jo Hamd Hai, I tried to copy that rhythm. I consciously use the word copy because you imitate, you copy, you learn from there. These are simple words and also not very favorable words, but that is how. So there is a long discourse that can be developed about how language changes hands and how language makes its impact from speaker to speaker and listener to listener. But short of time, and therefore I cannot be in a position to develop on all that. But this anthology, if you have a chance to look at, you will see that 500 years of Urdu poetry, the Ghazaliya riwayat or Nazmiya riwayat hai. This provides a thesis for you to develop your issues in translation and engage with that further in your studies. My addressees were essentially students, not my friends, scholars who have known this all. Unke liye to ye bahut mamuli si baat hai. But for students, this might be some point of consideration for them. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
My apologies for reminding you of the time. I have been warned that everything can wait but not lunch. So we have to break the session at 1:45. And for that reason also, and in any case, plenaries are generally unquestionable. So we may not have any questions at the end of the talks. Correct. And so may I now request our second plenary speaker, Professor Akshay Kumar, to give his talk. And I already kind of forewarned Akshay that it would be about 20 minutes.
I'm using that as a marker here.
Yes.
So this is a kind of a happy departure that I've been served the notice before I actually come here. And very respectful audience. So, already many things have been, should I say, preempted suitably because Professor Rahman started with subtle distinction between speaking to and speaking with. In the morning, we had a Vice Chancellor's important address where he was talking about consuming the culture, the other culture, in order to translate the other culture. And in Pushpinder's lecture, she was talking about the role of the graphics and the memes and the pop-ups. So all these three interventions in the morning create a kind of a fertile beginning for my intervention here. What I'm talking about here is that people are talking about languages and the interaction of, or the intersection of language and literatures. But I think we need to actually enhance the portfolio of languages. And therefore, I'm talking about the non-verbal languages, the emojis and the memes, and the graphics, Already we are heralding what is known as the graphocentric culture. And other thing which is very important, and this has always interested me, this whole idea of speaking with and speaking to. A translator needs to have a sense of comfort, not a sense of intimidation. Before I translate Ghalib, or I translate Kabir, or I translate Gita, or any other such powerful text, I will have to create for myself a space of intimacy without intimidation. And therefore, speaking with me is not just a matter of cosmopolitan coexistence. It's a matter of, as a French philosopher Alain Badiou says in praise of love, it's a love game. And you already, because you were referring to ghazal, ghazal is an eye-to-eye communication of the lover and the beloved. As Nirala would say when describing Ram Sita love, naino se naino ka priya sambhashan. That kind of comfort and intimacy is required. And if you enter into that kind of a zone of intimacy, you can afford to be playful. Therefore, I'm referring to the important role of playfulness in translation. People call it ludic translation. I'm not happy with that phrase. But translation has to be, we are not supposed to put translation into some hierarchy. This is the original text, and at the lower hierarchy, there is the translated text. The two texts can exist alongside. And therefore, what I'm proposing today is a poetics of serious fun, joyful reverence, a poetics of working alongside, not in a hierarchical relationship. Because I don't have time enough, so I will like to run through these some examples which I picked up from two translations. One is Mani Rav's translation of Gita. Other is Daljit Nagaraj's translation of Ramayana. Both these translations have received, as it happens with every text, mixed reviews, but I'm not bothered about those things. For me, these are good experiments. Whether these experiments go further or just are halted here, I can't say. But let me look at, say, can you say, place Gita 1 here? Is this visible to you? Can you make it? Lights band kar dijiye, light band kijiye. Now what she has done is, look at, this is the volume of the translation of Gita 1. Normally you get Gita in not less than 300-400 pages translation. This is just very slim volume of Mani Rav's translation. And she uses a flowchart diagram here. Very minimalistic language and content words. Now, of course, this brings some raciness, and of course, there's little room for distraction. And you begin to realize that this kind of I would say, Bakhtin Carmelisque, is inbuilt into the act of translation. There's an element of Carmel inbuilt here. Throughout the translation, this is the frame which she uses, and this is where. And can we place Gita 2 also? Gita 2, just show, because we have to rush through. Gita 2. This is important. Throughout the translation, she is not using capital letters. But here in this particular situation, she uses this two bold words, I am. And she runs into a stalemate when she writes in the introduction that, for me, Gita is a love poem. Because love affords that space of intimacy, and love affords a space of, it says, when it comes to matter of love, the issues of fidelity, infidelity become very complex. They become very complex. And she will say that love is no less than war. Love involves risk as war involves death. It's no less. So say once I discover that's a love poem, it affords me that playfulness. The text affords me that playfulness. But this I am is very interesting because throughout the text I've told you that there's no capital letter used. And she says when it comes to translating the Vishwarupam, the Virat Roop of Krishna, I had no words. So right in the middle of the page, and this is modern type, they use typographic, the computer, the digital word comes into play, the typographic experiments of concrete poetry, of the letterist poetry are harnessed for translation. If you look at some other translations, say Wilkins, when he translates that Virat Swarup of Krishna, he would say, there is not any living thing greater than I. Wilkins, the one who translated the colonial period. Aurobindo would use God in power of becoming, followed by an explication in about 10 printed pages. Radha Krishnan, in his translation, borrows a Christian term, transfiguration, to describe what he calls the stupendous revelation of Krishna. Anant Pai, in his that graphic that we have read, Amar Chitra Katha, which travels to every middle class home as a kind of a moral text. This is how he brings the graphic and the Gothic together. He will say that Krishna immediately assumed a terrible form. Flashes of lightning blazed out of him as he laughed. And this, you understand, because remember that now this has this kind of a, should I say, slogan, epithet has traveled all over. I love Hyderabad, with that love red stick. It started with Milton Grazer's I love New York. I and then the red letter heart and then NY. So look at how the digital world is now transforming languages, the whole act of encounter. Love is an encounter, love is an event. So look at this displacement of I here. Throughout I've told you there is no capitalization, there are no bold letters used here, but she uses here. She thinks that she's proposing a non-oppressive Gita. A Gita that talks to the reader. Can we have the other slide for is Gita as well? Yes, these are, look at this another, which is a very, very common form of people. Modern poets are using these techniques very often, putting things into two parallel columns. When the sun is in the north, when the sun is in the south, when it is bright daylight, when it is smoke dark night, when the moon is waxing, when the moon is waning, those who have known. Look at this, this is a kind of a, so each column is counterbalanced in a carefully calibrated binary frame. So more than a verbal act, and this is the one phrase which is used by Marshall McLuhan, verbo-voco-visual. Verbi-voco-visual. It's verbal, it's vocal, it's visual. This is the new terrain, this is the new ambit within which the modern translator is supposed to operate. So this is a double voice, do it in a way. This kind of mini drama is enacted in the act of translation itself. Can we have the next one? Oh, this is, I don't need to say anything more on that, but you see once again the approximations used here and the science. This is called, Perloff would call it Dada mathematics. Dada mathematics. Metaphysics, the math of metaphysics. Next. This is interesting. This is Daljit Nagra. This is Ramayana, from Ramayana. And look at the line above, changing. Maya had apparently returned all Ravana's army. Charging towards Rama came some shy and retiring types. The tone is throughout playful. I've told you this is a very synesthetic morphism of seriousness, of playfulness, of visual, non-verbal, verbal. It's a very synesthetic kind of an experience. It's a whole art experience, I would say. And look at it. These are interesting configurations on the page. This is actually the breaking the tyranny of the page. Page had become monotonous and it had to be brought, it had to be given some live animation. The modern day translator, I'm saying modern day, let me make it a little more sharp. The digital born generation is looking at this page is very flat. Its two-dimensionality has to be broken. Therefore, these translations are also called this non-linear translation. The granted linearity of the page is broken. This is what the reader would say, in a way, graphocentrism. So, but look at this. This is not, of course, one can, because we are sitting in an Urdu university, we know calligraphy and the impact of calligraphy. Already we have example of the verbo and the verbi vocab. But look at this. These are very offbeat fonts. These are not ordinary fonts. They are not easily available. They are not freely available. These fonts are available at a cost. And font is a big industry, by the way, in the West. Each font, there are teams involved, and it goes in. Let me show the next one. Okay, before we can come back to this later, but show the next one. Next one. This one. Again, the play of fonts here. These are the spirits of air, water, earth, fire. And look at the fonts used here. Stomach, spleens, giblets, blood, water, gore, gallow. All these are 4 different fonts. This is a translation of Ramayana. Stomach is inscribed in the typeface called Desdemona. Spleens is in Lucida black letter. Giblets is in marker felt. Blood, water in Mistral, and gore galore is in rosewood. These are different fonts. Each of these fonts has its specific characteristic. For instance, the font Desdemona is best used to describe horror. In horror movies, people use the Desdemona, which is the stomach one. Mistral has been used to type logos of crime dramas and sitcom shows. Rosewood is a bicolor font used hitherto to type advertisement for fun shows and cinematic techniques in the narration of the epic tale. So what you get is, so this is a very intelligent use of the fonts, and these fonts each font has its own cultural baggage, its own cultural, so to say, richness about it, a mandate in a way. Each font has a mandate about it. So you can't use Gorgalo for a happy equation. This is a Gothic kind of a font which you can best use to describe a horror situation. Can we go back to the previous one? The previous one? Yes. This is very interesting. This is Sita being circumscribed by the Lakshman Rekha. Sita in Lakshman Rekha. Look at, these are instances where the logocentric and the graphocentric, the phrastic and the ekphrastic, the enunciated and the enounced become irrelevant. And therefore people are talking about, because mine is not Urdu-centric discourse, because I'm referring texts which are not in Urdu, and I'm no competent in Urdu, I must admit, but would language matter now to that extent? Because we're entering into a different kind of a domain. Or maybe have a mix of language and the visual together. But here, look at this kind of a what I call isochronous concentric verbo-visual constellation. In fact, this word is very important, constellation. I'll come to that later on. Now, these are translations which are being experimented now in a big way. In fact, not that these were experiments we have had in the phase of concrete poetry, in the phase of lettrist poetry, but now these are being extrapolated for translation purposes. So can we show the next one? So this is, I think Hanuman is very well known to the people of Karnataka now. The flame at the end of his hairy serpent tail was a fireball. Hanuman. So throughout the text, not that it is, throughout the text, you will get about 100 such, I can't call them images. These are again mixtures of the verbo, vico, visual. Throughout the text, such images are played. So what I'm saying to you is that we are creating now a translation which is a translation of that operates along multiple paths, not linear paths, multiple paths. And here you create a each shloka, each couplet, each chopai comes as in a form of a visual geometry. There's a special spread that is weaved on the page so that the flat monotony of the page is broken. There's this effort, constantly effort. So as I told you that this is, people call it a ludic turn in translation, people call it, but this in a way, as I said, that this is a multi-sensory infusion. It's a multi-modular approach to translation. As I anticipate in the days to come, people would bring memes into it, people would bring more. In fact, if you read morning day messages, people are using images. Language is vanishing there. And if images can become part of your everyday parlance, why can't images become part of your translation? I'm not saying, I'm not declaring a death of language here. I'm not making any apocalyptic claims here. But what I'm saying is now this is a very interesting mixture that we're entering into. This is a kind of a very, I'm using this phrase from Deleuze, a rhizometric kind of an arrangement, assemblage of different mediums. Ludic is not trivializing. This is not an act of trivializing the original. It's a serious fun. So this is, he was referring to the word dialogic. This is dialogic mobilization. Dialogic is a word that comes from Bakhtin. And Bakhtin's keyword is carnival. So a translator is now creating and carnival where? Carnival where? In a text which is patently oppressively sacred. He's creating a carnival. And that is the language of communication. Dialogue cannot be a dialogue only of serious nature. Dialogue involves a sense of playfulness. I think I've taken 20 minutes now. Thank you very much. I need not speak much. Thank you. There is one thing more, just if you can show. Just one. Sorry. That Meghdutam is now being used on a digital medium. This you can you show that? If you can show that.
Love and the mask of me reviving you. This heavenly excite fixed my eager view. And still the melancholy tear suppressed. The bitter sorrow round my hidden chest is gathering darkness with a troubled heart.
Stop it, it will go on, other to go on. But I said I will be talking about constellation. Translation would henceforth be an act of installation, art installation. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. Extremely thankful to both the speakers for sticking to this arbitrary time that we imposed on them. I know that we are about a couple of minutes away from the deadline, but there is one quick request, and that is the gentleman here.
I think considering the time at lunch, इनसे बात करने नहीं, I would request please sanctity of this session. आप दोनों लोग के हैं lunch पे अपनी सारी curiosity कीजिए. Please do not. This is my request to you. Please.
Okay.
I mean, I can understand your.
Thank you. So we have about 2 minutes, and I will use those 2 minutes for my own little bit of. Thank you so much. I think one interesting commonality between the two papers that came across was how do we approach translation? And where do we begin? Because as Professor Anil Rahman said, we cannot simply translate a shairi into a couplet, right? And of course, we all know that the very word translation cannot be translated. Right? So where do we actually translate? Where do we start the translation process? Recently, I was teaching a couple of stories in my class, and we had this wonderful discussion with the students. Currently, I teach the BTech students, technology students. We were looking at 3 words: communication, translation, and interpretation. Now, where do we draw a line among these 3? Can you communicate sometimes without translating? Do you necessarily communicate even when you are speaking the same language? The example that we took was this short story by Jhumpa Lahiri, Interpreter of Maladies, where everybody speaks English, but nobody understands the other. And then we were also looking at a story by R.K. Narayan called A Horse and Two Goats, where they don't speak each other's language, but still communicate. So, the 3 words that we were playing around with were these: communication, translation, and interpretation. And can you translate without interpretation? I mean, is translation possible without interpretation? Because every reading is an interpretation. And obviously, every translation is a reading. And therefore, although these look like, different domains, I think reading, translating, interpreting, these are all, in a way, overlap each other. And what Professor Akshay Kumar showed is what, of course, we are all familiar with in some poetry, where the image poems represent the meaning of the poem. But how those, how we can, and I'm sure Mani would be extremely happy to learn about your take on her translation. Yeah. So it's, and yes, the way Mani Rao translates the Gita is very different from what we have grown up with. Radha Krishnan and all that very serious, way in which the texts are translated. And this is in spite of the fact that she is translating what is probably a very quintessential religious text. But the way she approaches the text is very different. And what Professor Anisur Rahman said about imitating the rhythm of poetry was something very interesting. Because in poetry, because we all talk about what is lost in poetry, what is lost in translation, but very rarely do we talk about what is gained in translation. We all know that there was this, I think, this mathematician, Golden Aisha Bach. He talks about, he looks at 3 variations of translation, and then looks at how each translation actually contributes to our perception of the original. So translation need not always be an imitative process, but it can also be a kind of a contributory factors. And that's what Professor Anisur Rahman said, when texts enter into a dialogue with each other, they actually enrich themselves through that dialogue. And therefore, I think the whole idea, and of course, this is not a new idea for those of us in India, because let me just end with something that always puzzled me, that why in India, where we had a kind of a theoretical treatises on everything from economics to Arthashastra to Kama Sutra, why is it that we never had a theoretical text on translation? I'm not aware of it, and please enlighten me if there is. Is there a kind of a theoretical treatise on translation in India? Is it either because translation is so normal in our day-to-day life that there is only somebody who does not belong to this kind of a multicultural milieu will think of theorizing translation, whereas for us, it's an everyday reality. And secondly, of course, is what has been a problem is the invisibilization of the translator, where the texts are translated as if it's directly, and that's becoming more and more a problem. And of course, today it has actually become an extremely contested legal problem. That how do you acknowledge, not just acknowledge, but also accommodate the translator in the entire process of translation. And we know that the recent prizes recognize the translator as a co-author. The prize money today is divided between the author and the translator. So when we read reviews of translation, very often we don't even know that this is a review of a translated book, because the translator is not even mentioned, and it is as if we are reading a review of the original. Right? So there are these issues that we can go on talking about the problems of translation, but I think it's time that we actually talk about the gains of translation. And I'm sure the rest of the sessions will also dwell on some of what we can get from translation, what we can gain from translation, rather than keep on bemoaning what is lost in translation. Thank you very much. And once again, I'm grateful to both the speakers for sticking to the time and the organizers for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. I express my heartfelt gratitude to the esteemed chair, Professor T. Vijay Kumar, and the distinguished speakers, Professor Anisur Rahman and Professor Akshay Kumar, for a lively and interesting session. I hope we can all benefit from the knowledge that has been imparted in this session. With this, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of this plenary session, and I thank everyone for being such an amazing audience. We shall now proceed to the guest house for lunch. But before that, a quick announcement. All those who will be presenting papers today, please return immediately after lunch, as we shall be starting 3 parallel technical sessions by 2:30. The venue is the same department, auditorium, room B and room C in CPDUMT. Thank you, everyone.